Welcome everyone to this REC Code Manager webinar, where we're going to have a look at changes that are being introduced to the Secure Data Exchange Protocol in REC version 3.0 coming on the 18th of July 2022. As I mentioned, we are going to be using slido.com to field your questions today and for you to provide feedback as well. If you haven't used it before, it's really simple. You can visit slido.com on your web browser and enter the code on your screen now, 3050295. Or if you've got a phone handy, you can just scan the QR code on the right with your camera and it will take you directly to the event page as well. And as we reach the Q&A section at the end of today's agenda, your questions will be displayed on the screen and will allow our panel of code manager and Reco experts to field them at the appropriate point of the day. I'll come back to that QR code and slide in a minute in case you've missed that information. But just before we do kick off, a little bit about who you're going to hear from today. My name is Paul Rock. I am the REC Code Manager's Head of Communications, and I'm going to essentially steer the agenda for today. Although my colleague Anne Perry, who's the Change Delivery Manager within the Code Manager, will be doing most of the talking and driving us through the bulk of the agenda, ably supported by John Hawkins, who works for Reco within the operations and transformation team, and he's been heavily involved in the design of the new arrangements and SDEP, and he'll be providing Anne with support through her parts today. And both Anne and John will be joined by Beth Brown and Neil Brinkley, both from the Code Manager's Technical Services team, and they'll together be fielding your questions at the end of the session today. Just a few bits of housekeeping before we do start. I would ask you keep your cameras and your microphones switched off during the event today. We do have a large number of people on the call, so in the interest of having a secure bandwidth, I think it's probably best we keep our cameras off, but I will ask our presenters to put their cameras on so you can see them as they present. And just for your information, you should have seen when you joined, but this event is being recorded like all the REC Code Manager events. And in the days following this session, we'll be publishing the edited recording of the event on the REC portal onto our REC Code Manager YouTube channel. And we'll be circulating the link for anyone who wasn't able to join today, or for you to share with any of your colleagues who might benefit from the information that we're going to discuss. I've already mentioned how we're going to use Slido, and I'll ask you to get ready to ask your questions on that tool, and we'll be asking you to leave some feedback at the end of the event about things that went well and things that we could do to improve Code Manager events going forward. And as I mentioned, probably the way we're going to run today, rather than having questions throughout, I think Anne is going to take you through the presentation, and we're going to collate those questions to be answered at the end. But please put your questions onto Slido, and we'll just pick them up at the end of the session. It may be that Anne answers your questions as she moves through her slides. For those who weren't able to pick up that Slido link before, just a reminder there to join via slido.com, entering the code 3050295. You can also access via that QR code, and then joining via that link will give you the option to add questions to a question and answer field. You can upvote your colleagues' questions, so if they're pertinent to you and you particularly want them to be answered, you can upvote them and they'll rise to the top for when we get round to the Q&A, or you can leave your own on there as well. And my colleague Amy, who is with me today, is essentially going through them questions as well, making sure that there's no duplicates in there, and she'll be moving them to the archive as they're answered throughout the day. All right. So before I hand over to Anne, just wanted to recap on the agenda for today, the items that you're going to hear from. After I've finally finished, I shall pass over to Anne and John, who are going to go over a bit of background as to why the secure data exchange process is changing. Anne will touch on the scope of the changes that are coming, as well as the impacts on the different types of REC parties. And then finally, how parties will be expected to manage any in-flight escalations that are still live at that cutover period on REC version 3 go live. At the end of that session, we'll pass over into the Q&A section where we'll have the whole panel available to you to field any questions that have come up over the course of the afternoon. All in all, we expect it to last no longer than an hour and a half or so. And without further ado, I think it's probably time for me to hand over to Anne and John, who are going to take you through the background to the changes.
Great, thanks, Paul. Afternoon, everyone, and it's good to see so many people have joined the call, and hopefully you'll all find this a useful session. As Paul said, my name's Anne Perry. I'm the REC Change Delivery Manager, and we'll be taking you through obviously the key content for today's session, and hopefully getting all of your questions answered at the end of the session. If we can just move on. I suppose before we start talking about some of the specific changes to the Secure Data Exchange Portal, so to SDEP, just thought it'd be worth a bit of a recap of what's got us to this point. So as part of REC version 3, the new resolution of consumer-facing switching and billing issues, so CFSB schedule, is being introduced. And it was actually under the Master Registration Agreement, so under MRA, that the SDEP impacts from the switching programme and the new CFSB schedule were first identified and discussed. Marasco initiated a change request for a formal impact assessment at that point to identify what changes that the CFSB schedule is going to drive through into SDEP. However, it wasn't taken forward at that time under MRA. But what has happened then is under REC, RECO have then taken forward that assessment and are through the REC-driven activity, the RECO-driven activity, implementing the necessary changes to SDEP at CSS Go Live. So the changes themselves actually reflect the processes that are set out in the CFSB schedule. And so what I'm going to do is hand over to John at this point to actually talk about what the CFSB schedule is looking to achieve and the changes that's brought in then through those processes.
Thanks, Anne. Next slide, please. There we are. As Anne said, the changes to the SDEP have all been driven through changes being introduced through the new CFSB schedule. And essentially what that does is that consolidates and simplifies a number of existing procedures that existed under the MRA and SPA and moved into the MRA and SPA transition schedule in the REC that covered various issues like erroneous transfers and cross meters and disputed switch meter readings and things like that. And when we were looking at code consolidation under the switching program, there was a view that if you grouped these together, they all have similar resolution paths, similar resolution outcomes, and all essentially relate to an issue impacting a consumer, either due to or as part of a switch or affecting the accuracy of their bills. And so it was thought that there was an opportunity to simplify that and to improve that by consolidating all of them into a dual fuel schedule that covers the end-to-end processes for all of those scenarios and applying some general principles on top. And so that's what it does. And the objective of the schedule is that it provides that framework for cooperation to resolve those issues in a timely manner with the minimum negative impact on consumers, and also for setting out the process for resolving disputed or delayed resolutions between those energy suppliers, that only applies to energy suppliers within the schedule. If we go on to the next slide, please. I just want to talk through a bit about how the schedule's been drafted and structured. And it's quite a large document, but it's split into 7 sections. And broadly, that is section A, which sets out the general obligations that apply to all parties who are required to comply with the schedule. And sections B to G are individual operational procedures. that set out the various problems, description of those problems, the required resolution outcomes, and the resolution procedure for each of those. And those are specific for the issue that's been defined. So that relates to erroneous switches, switch meter read problems, which is a combination of missing change of supply meter readings and disputed change of supply meter readings, crossed meters, duplicate RMPs, which for those who aren't familiar with the new term of RMP, that is essentially a dual fuel term for MPAN or MPRN used in switching. So that's where there are multiple MPANs or MPRNs in error, and there should only be one. Misdirected payments and debt assignment. So that's for the debt assignment protocol, or DAP as people know. The key differences in what this brings in really come in section A. Sections B to G are largely unchanged from what people do today. Section A sets out general standards that apply in all of these scenarios. And there are two parts to that. One is the consumer principles and outcomes, and that is the minimum requirement that energy suppliers and other REC parties referred to there have to follow in relation to all of these consumer impacting issues. So in terms of compliance with the REC going forwards, it's not just have I followed a process from A to B as things were worded previously, it's also have I met the required principles and outcomes to resolve the issue for that consumer. And so there's a higher obligation there to be met, which is what this schedule introduces. It also standardizes the escalation process. So before, each of the individual procedures that I referred to have their own escalation process. And what this schedule does is it brings in a standard shortened escalation process that applies to any missed service levels in this schedule. So the key emphasis here is that previously there were 3 levels of escalation after a supplier failed to respond to a query, and there was an escalation to an operational contact, then a further escalation to a higher operational contact, and then a final escalation to the contract manager. This slims that down and makes it a bit slicker and says you have to meet your obligation in the REC, you have to respond within the required time, that is your obligation. If you are in breach of that obligation, there is an escalation to a relevant contact to resolve that. If they fail to resolve that within 5 working days, it gets escalated to the contract manager. There's then after that, if the contract manager fails to resolve the non-compliance, an opportunity where that can be referred to the code manager, and the code manager can consider if a referral to the Performance Assurance Board is required. The intent of this is really to speed up the resolution of these issues, to avoid, failed SLAs being delayed further with no eventual outcome at the end of it, and if required, to apply relevant performance assurance techniques if there is poor performance repeatedly. That means that these escalations aren't being resolved. So that's what I was going to cover, and that really sets out the context of what Anne's going to talk you through in terms of the changes that are needed to the SDEP, that broadly the changes in the escalation levels, the new processes covered in here, and the fact that the escalation procedure applies to any process now within the schedule.
Great, thanks, John. So if we can then just move forward and we'll talk about the actual changes themselves. So there are 4 areas of change that will be seen in SDEP. So the first one kind of feeds straight from what John was talking through, which is around those escalation levels. So in line with the schedule, all of the current second line escalation levels will be removed from the processes. So this will impact new and existing messages. So as John has said, there's going to be those 2 escalation levels. So the first one being the operational contact, and then the final, which is the contract manager. So what we've done on the screen there is listed all of the messages that are impacted, and those are all of the escalation messages. So that's covering kind of disputed reads, the erroneous transfers, erroneous transfer re-registration. So that all of the processes at the moment that have those escalation levels within SDEP, that second level is being removed. Move on. The second area of change that will be seen in SDEP is around new messages. So again, it's this reflection of the changes to the schedule. There are going to be 4 new messages that are being introduced to SDEP. The first 2 that were shown here, these relate to the duplicate meter points with a general query for electricity, and then on here we've got the gas escalation. And again, it's that first and final escalation points being introduced as defined within the schedule. And if we can move on to the next other new ones, again, these are the escalations. So we've got here the duplicate meter points for electricity and the cross meters for electricity. So hopefully you've seen there's a bit of a consistent message here that, you know, the changes that we're seeing, it is being driven by that schedule changes. These are the schedule is introducing the new processes, the new escalation processes, and the new query for the resolution. And so therefore the SDEP messages themselves need to be introduced to be able to fulfill and meet the schedule requirements and obligations for the resolution of the escalations through SDEP. And then if we can move on. And then the third area of impact here around the actual removal of 2 messages. So 2 messages have been removed as they're no longer required under the new switching arrangements. So these are the customer requested objections, and that's the general query for both gas and electricity. It's worth being aware that the data for these messages, so that the comms themselves, are going to be available. So they're historic queries. However, there'll be limited actions that can be completed within those messages. So you'll be able to view the messages and the attachments. However, you won't be able to raise any new messages or make changes to those messages or reassign or add any comments. And that again is to reflect the need under the new arrangements, under the CFSB schedule. There is no process here that these relate to, and therefore that's the reason for the removal. And then the final kind of key change is around a kind of more relatively straightforward one, which is the renaming of the CSS data cleanse message. So this now becomes the supplier data error resolution. So nothing is changing for this message apart from it being renamed. So when looking for the kind of the message, it's going to be that obviously under that new name. But apart from that, everything else remains the same within those messages. If we can, move on. So I suppose it's what does it mean for parties then? So the main impacts are on energy suppliers. So escalation routes, so the escalation levels have changed with that second escalation level being removed, and that is ultimately to provide that quicker resolution and better service to consumers. The removal of messages, so for those 2 messages that have been removed because they're no longer relevant or required, you will be able to see the historical escalations, but like I say, not necessarily assign those to people or raise new ones, but the information is there to help that resolution of any outstanding issues that there are. And what we're then seeing is new messages. So with the new messages that are being set up, those 4 new messages, there is an action here that's required, which is obviously users will need to be set up to receive the messages and obviously to be able to pick those up and to work those through and resolve the queries. And then the final one there, which is around the amendment to the message name. This is the only change that has an impact on the DNOs, and this is just that name change, so of where you will find it and how that message is named within SDEP. So kind of that's the party impact. If we can move on, I think the other final kind of key thing, I suppose, to talk through is what is going to happen to those in-flight escalations that are currently at kind of stage 2. So what's going to happen at kind of implementation at CSS Go Live is there is going to be an automatic system generated activity that will take the current second level escalations and revert those to the first escalation point. That's going to happen automatically. However, I think it's worth being aware that if a person who is currently assigned to a second escalation is also a first escalation point for those same messages, then the in-flight escalation will be assigned to them automatically. However, if not, that person will be removed from that escalation. The in-flight escalations are also going to follow the new escalation route. So if they were partway through that second level escalation, what's going to happen is when they revert back up, go to the day 1 of the first escalation point. So there's going to actually be 5 working days to resolve that escalation as a first level escalation once that reversion has happened. Before then it can be escalated to the final stage, so to the contract manager stage. So I think the key thing really is that there is a call out here to say to avoid any in-flight stage 2 escalations reverting to a different first stage escalation points. We'd be looking kind of when the changes are implemented for any second line escalation contacts to be set up in the system as a first escalation point. That just means that there's that retention of the kind of ownership of the in-flight stage 2 escalations. And obviously what we are aware of is that there could be a resource implications for any escalations that are due to go to that final escalation stage. So I think it's just something to say that suppliers would also just need to consider if they have that sufficient resource assigned for those final escalations, which obviously should be the contract manager, but there is the ability with an SDEP to assign more than just the contract manager to those escalations. So that is something that we'd expect and would like to see parties reviewing, ready for obviously taking forward the escalations as they need to. So I think from a kind of an impact perspective and kind of what is actually changing, those are the key elements really. It is obviously the changes that we've talked through, so the removal of the escalation levels, the new messages that are being brought in to reflect the new processes that are in the schedule, the removal of the messages and the renaming of the messages, and obviously in line with that there's the in-flight messages and how they are going to be managed, and the fact that any that are at the second stage escalation point that at go live will actually be removed. As I say, they're going to revert to the first stage escalation point, so would need to be planned for.
Under the car.
So I think that is the key element. So I think what we expected is obviously the overview of what the changes are, but the key thing now is really to use this time to answer the questions that people have, any specifics about the changes themselves, and obviously anything associated with the changes of when that goes live.
Thank you, Anne. Really clearly presented impacts of the changes that are coming up, and plenty of time and opportunity for those on the call to ask their questions. Now, hopefully you've been engaging on. Oh, I can already see there are questions that have come through on Slido, which is great. And please feel free to continue. It looks like people have been upvoting as well, which is great because it means we can see the most popular questions at the top, as I said before. So first question there, I suppose, and I'm not sure who wants to take this, whether it's something for my technical services colleagues in the code manager team, but whether escalation to the code manager, so that sort of second level, happens within SDES, or is there an alternative, more manual route for that escalation to happen?
I can pick that one up if you like. So it's not gonna happen with an SDEP. So the escalation process is actually through the kind of the standard appeals and escalation form. So that would need to be completed. The form is available on the REC portal, and then the completed form either needs to be sent through to the REC service desk or through to the performance assurance mailbox. That will then be picked up by the assurance team and obviously taken forward and reviewed.
Fantastic, thank you. Carl, you have your hand raised. Do you want to verbalise your question?
That was my question, so I just thought I'd follow up based on the answer.
Fabulous.
The whole point of having SDEP to start with was so that personal data was sent securely. If people are now being asked to email personal data on forms to the code manager or to performance assurance, that seems to go against the initial reasoning for it being implemented in the first place.
So I think what we've got at the moment is obviously the changes right now are to do with bringing in the changes that the CFSB is driving. I think what we'll do is we'll take an action away to talk to the assurance team around what controls there are around that protection of that data. There isn't currently any plans to expand the SDEP functionality at the moment to cover off that escalation to code manager. I'm not necessarily saying we're going to rule it out, but I think it is something that we would need to take away and just assess and just understand. One is what the current controls are around the protection of data at go live, but also are there any future plans to expand the functionality to include that escalation? Like I say, there aren't at the moment, unless Beth or Neil, you're aware of anything that's kind of in flight around that escalation.
There's not in the SDEP review. There's nothing in the SDEP review at the moment on that, but that's not to say it couldn't be factored in. So Anne, we can take that away with you and discuss with the assurance team.
Because the minimum requirement was for 128-bit encryption, which if it's uploaded via the portal is fine, but email isn't.
I guess the objective of that would be to allow the code manager to challenge both the parties on being able to meet the requirements of the code and to be compliant. So I don't know exactly how much information would need to be included in order to progress that. It might not be the same level of information as required for both the parties to fix it at an earlier stage. So that's something we can discuss as well with the assurance team.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you, Carl. I'm going to take a couple of questions I can see on the screen together, and that's, is the code manager prepared for the number of cases that could potentially be escalated to them? And are code managers expecting to raise individual issues or bulk escalations? Because I think they're probably linked with each other. I don't think on the panel we have someone from the performance assurance team, do we, Anne? But I assume that there has been an exercise done within the code manager team to ensure readiness from our side to deal with these.
Yeah, there has. I think the assurance team, like I say, unfortunately they're not on the call, so they have confirmed they have done their obviously a readiness activity. I think the key thing is about monitoring the level of cases. So I think there isn't necessarily expected to be a like-for-like volume. I think with the shift to faster switching and obviously the changes that the CFSB brings in and the drive really to see the kind of consumer outcomes and kind of the resolution from a consumer perspective being met within the kind of the current BAU timeframes rather than having to get escalated. But if they're going to monitor the volumes that go live to see actually are they seeing that the kind of the volumes that they're expecting, what do they need to do around kind of resource, they do have and are prepared for go live, but they will be definitely reviewing volumes both from a resource perspective but also understanding performance post go live.
And on that second point around whether they're expected to send individual queries or bulk escalations, is there clarity on that, or is it on a case on an individual basis?
I think it is on an individual basis. However, let's take an action away just to provide a definitive response.
Thank you, Anne. Noted. Okay. Is any reporting available to look into how many escalations reach the current second escalation level? I suppose that's in the current world.
And I'm going to perhaps Neil or Beth, if you're aware of the reporting outputs.
As far as I'm aware, there isn't specific. There might be counts. So again, we can take that away.
There are a couple of reports, Beth, that they can use. There's two reports at the moment, where you can run a report to see any escalations that you've received that are exceeding response times, and it will detail the current escalation level within that and one where you can see any that you've sent where you should have received a response and haven't, and you can see the escalation level within that. So there are 2 existing reports where you can see it, not for ones that you still have time to deal with, but for ones that are exceeding that time, there is a way to identify those today.
Okay, fabulous. Thank you for that information. And if there are any questions that we're not able to fully answer today, we'll make sure we capture those and provide a full response with the recording when that goes out in a few days' time, or maybe slightly after if it takes us a bit of time to get a full answer.
Hi, sorry, Paul. Can I just add to that we've had a quick look from our end, and we can't see anything that highlights second level escalations. It just highlights escalations as a broader topic. But if we were looking to highlight what would go to a contract manager and what wouldn't, there isn't reporting that we could use right now that would help us.
I'll take that away, Rachel, because my understanding is that there is a data item within that report for escalation level, for the current escalation level, so it should have an option there for you to be able to that.
That'd be helpful. Like, we've tried and failed. Yeah.
I'll pick it up with you offline.
Thank you, John.
There is a current level escalation level in that report, John, but all you can do is set a date range. You can't really do a decent MI report on how many we get per day, week or month without going in and breaking it down by date range. And it only flags it up if it's outstanding at the time you do the report.
Yeah, but I'm aware it's for outstanding only. I think what I'd suggest is if there are usability issues with that report, then I'd suggest feeding those in as potential candidates for the review that Beth and the team are leading on, because that's the exact type of thing that is absolutely worth being brought into that piece of work.
Yes, thank you, John. That's what we're looking at the moment, actually. So you should hear more from us fairly soon on looking at reporting needs from SDEP users.
Thank you. The top question now is a follow-up to a previous question. So further to the to whether the escalations to the code manager happens in SDS, if that's not the case, which I think we've clarified it isn't, are we relying on the operational contacts list? Now, I'm presuming, I may be wrong, I don't know the CFSB as well as perhaps John does. Are requests to the code manager made through the service desk, John? Is that the intent?
That's right. So Anne mentioned before that it would be through the escalation and appeals form that would be sent either through the service desk or directly to the performance assurance mailbox. So you wouldn't need the operational contact list for that. You, I think, to be fair, the email address is on the form itself as well of where you should submit it to. So you wouldn't need to refer to that. Thank you, John.
Sorry, can I just ask on the back of that? Would anyone be able to raise that ticket, or is it just the contract managers?
I don't believe there's a restriction on it to date, but I think anyone authorised on behalf of that organisation could refer it to the code manager as long as it had followed the correct procedure and the contract manager had failed to resolve the non-compliance.
So would we be able to see an overview of the volume that are coming through if they're not going through the contract managers?
What do you mean by that, Joe? Sorry.
So if anyone can raise a ticket and they're not just going through the contract manager, would the contract managers be able to see the volume that being escalated through to the code manager?
I'm not sure that there's a plan to produce any form of report coming out from the code manager at this stage. I think it's within the contract manager's gift what internal controls they want to put organisationally on who would do that. So, for instance, if the contract manager wanted to restrict that to particular people or have an internal mechanism to monitor it, or at least ensured they were copied into to a request, then I think that's within the gift internally of the contract manager. I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think there is a plan for any kind of external report coming from the code manager as a standard piece of work at the moment, is there?
Not at the moment, no, there isn't.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Joe. Top one now is customizable reporting. Not so much a question as I think a wish on the wish list for something that might come out of it. But I'm not sure, guys from the technical services code manager team, whether there's any changes to the current reporting that are being developed as part of the version 3 release.
Yeah, as per by my previous comment, we're looking to do some work on that very shortly. So you'll be hearing from us. We are looking at the option of having a kind of raw data extract that parties could do with as they wanted. So yeah, you'll be hearing more from us soon.
That's great news. We look forward to hearing more. The top and the bottom questions on the screen now, I think, are the same thing. I had a similar question today. Actually, I was uploading some of the documents to the portal. I noticed the CFSB schedule contents page is currently lacking some information about what the headings refer to. I assume there's still some work to go before the release, John, on that, just to make sure it looks exactly what it needs to look like before release.
Yeah, it's I think it's an auto contents overlook there on the export from what's gone into the code, but I'm sure that can be cleared up relatively simply enough, so we can pick that up.
Absolutely, thank you. Top one on there at the moment. Will performance assurance be providing data to industry where suppliers are not meeting the obligations? John, I'm not sure whether there's anything in the processes around outward reporting from Code Manager on general industry performance.
So there's nothing standard in the code asking the PAB to do that. One of the techniques the PAB can employ is publishing performance data of REC parties, either anonymously or non-anonymously. I wasn't prepared for saying that. So the PAB could choose to publish this type of data in the future, or they could choose to publish other information as part of their monitoring. But at the moment, that would be fully at the discretion of the PAB on how they monitor and manage this risk. There's no standard requirement for them to do that.
Thanks, John. I think that covers the question there. Number 2 there, what reporting will be available for SDEP for suppliers that are not performing? If that's not the same question, if someone wants to clarify that, we'll help answer it, but I think it's probably the same point. Top there, I think probably a question for the technical guys at the Code Manager. Will the bell escalation identification in SDEP change at go live, and will the user guide be updated? I don't know if Beth or Neil have an answer with that one.
That would be for oh, sorry, Neil, were you going to jump in there?
No, go for it.
I was going to say that would be for the service provider to do, so we can check on exactly what the plans are, but that would be part of the updates to the system.
And an updated version of the user guide has been created by the service provider, I think, hasn't it, Beth, as well?
I believe so.
Yeah, for those of you who aren't aware, there are a number of documents for REC version 3 that have been baselined and are ready to go on July the 18th, and you can see all of those documents by going onto the REC documents page of the REC portal, and there's a section on that for REC version 3 baseline, and you can see all the different types of schedules, user guides, templates that have been updated and are ready to go once the 18th of July comes around. Top question. We struggle with escalations being archived before they are fully dealt with by the other supplier, which can mean missed escalations. Can this function be removed? This may be a request that sits slightly outside of the scope, I guess, of the session today, or the work that we're doing to be ready for REC version 3. But I don't know whether Beth or Neil, this is something that's feeding into the sort of wider work on SDEP.
I don't remember us getting that exact question before when we had the workshop and so on earlier this year, but we are looking to introduce a slightly different solution where parties proactively mark calls as resolved. So if you did lodge that as a question, or if you agree with it, maybe you can get in touch via the service desk and sort of give a bit more information about exactly how that scenario works, and then we can feed that in and see if the solutions that we're drawing together under the SDEP review at the moment would cover that off as well. That would be useful to have more detail on that.
Thank you, Beth. Next one on the list, I think we've covered this to some extent. So the implications of not meeting the obligations. We've spoken about the fact that there is no obligation on the code manager to report at the moment, but the Performance Assurance Board and the code manager recommending into that have a number of techniques that they can apply, and I think the changes to these escalation processes essentially accelerate that information coming to the code manager, and therefore them techniques will be applied more readily than perhaps they previously would have been. Is that a fair assumption? Again, we don't have performance assurance guys, but John, I don't know whether that was the intent of this, that some of those techniques can be applied a bit more easily.
Absolutely, and going a bit further than that, I mean, this was one of the kind of main intentions of the REC being introduced in the first place, and bringing in a robust performance assurance framework in the REC. Now, it's quite early on. The REC's only been live since September, and in general, you know, the first year of operation tends to be setting up and establishing the performance assurance framework. But there was, I think, what people need to take away is there was a reason that these changes were brought in, is because the regulator recognised that the current process wasn't working, it wasn't delivering for consumers, and industry performance wasn't as expected, and that needed to be improved. This is why the escalation levels have been simplified and brought a route into the performance assurance framework, so that if there is either industry-wide or specific party poor performance going forward in the future that leads to detriment to consumers, that is visible both to the PAB but also to the regulator, and action can be taken accordingly to address that poor performance if that's the case. And in considering that, people need to really remember you are non-compliant with the REC as soon as the first escalation has to be sent. So there is there's two opportunities to resolve that before it gets any further still. But the non-compliance happens at the point the response hasn't been sent to the point it was meant to. So I think it's really important that people do take this home and consider that, and if there are issues with their processes that mean a lot of them are getting escalated where they shouldn't do, that those are addressed going forwards, because there will be a route to address this in the future.
Thank you, John. The one at the bottom there, the latest questions come through. I think it's kind of related. So is there any way we can see how as a supplier we are performing and where we sit in a kind of league table? At the moment there's not, and I think if there was something that the PAB intended to do as part of the technique, they might look to do it, but I don't think at the moment that currently exists as a function. A few questions around reporting at the top here. Can we have a report that shows supplier ID and MPAN detail in reports in SDEP, so we can pull a report and make it easier for contract managers? And the reporting needs to improve to be able to measure this effectively as contract managers. Again, Beth, you've spoken around the changes to sort of the reporting framework. Are these things that you're in dialogue with as we move forward?
Yes, I think those would be covered by it, but we'll be looking for feedback. So if we haven't captured those exact requirements, then there'll be an opportunity to do that.
And indeed here a point on whether we can issue more guidance on how to use reporting that exists. That obviously there was some point raised by Rachel earlier that they may have missed an ability to report on an element within the data. So whether there can be further or clearer guidance issued on usage of reports. Is that something, Beth, do you think could be able to be supplementary information given around?
Yes, that? we haven't got to that stage in the review yet in terms of thinking about guidance and so on, and whatever changes end up ultimately being proposed and put forward, it would be obviously some way off before they were implemented. So if there are additional guidance needs for the current reporting set, then that's probably worth looking at separately.
Thank you. And is that the same for this top one here as well? A user guide on how escalations need to be managed within SDEP? Is that there is obviously there's an SDEP user guide? Is that presumably with the comment suggested that it might not go far enough to provide the guidance that might be required?
It could be. I guess it depends how much of that process sits within the system itself and how much sits in the kind of the CFSB arrangements that sort of back up or provide the foundation for what the system then allows you to do. So that's something we can take away and think about where is best and how that would be expressed to support parties.
Thank you. I suppose while we're on reporting, we'll stay here with a couple of the questions that have just come through. Someone noting around the timescales of progression of reporting improvements, that this is reporting's been an issue since the start of SDEP, and there's been no improvements yet ready for REC version 3. Beth, you've alluded to quite a period of work now for over a number of months that's been happening to define better reporting out of SDEP, haven't you? So I think we are aware that there is a gap and that we are making progress to resolve it. We just need to spend the right time getting those requirements correct at the moment.
Yes, and the second one on the screen there about a filter being added, I don't remember that being proposed as part of the work we did earlier this year. So again, if whoever proposed that, being able to filter the MPID on the main screen, you can see the from and to MPIDs and who last responded or who last put a message within that SDEP case. But again, if that's something that would be useful, if you can give us a bit more information, then we can look to add that in.
Thank you. And another one for you there, Beth. Do you have a rough timescale on when the reporting is likely to be released for use?
I don't at this stage. No, it would depend. Once we've produced the recommendations from the review, those would need to then go forward under the change process. So apologies, but it is a bit early to give you that information today.
No worries. There's been a couple of points to recirculate the latest SDEP guide. I think that's the user guide produced by the SDEP service provider. We can share it after the session. The current version, the one that's active as of now, is available on under REC documents under the category 3 documents. It's one of the user guides that falls under a category 3 document, and as I mentioned before, the sort of baseline version ready for REC version 3 is available on the REC version 3 baseline section of that REC documents page, but we can include links with the post-event documentation for those that are interested. Question here, shouldn't R45 also include a way for first escalations to be diverted to the contract manager on SDEP in preparation for the schedule changes? Apologies, I'm not fully up on my change references. And you know what R45 is?
I do, yeah. So this is the data specification changes that reflect the changes to SDEP. So the scope of R45 is really defined. It is purely to the changes to the message that we're seeing off the back of the change to SDEP that we walked through today. It's purely to make sure that the messages that are held within the data specification are accurate and correct. So it doesn't have that wider scope. So it is more of it isn't purely housekeeping, but it's more of an administration to make sure that the data specification is accurate at REC version 3 go live. So that kind of scope, it isn't part of that to do that activity or to expand the scope at that point.
Wonderful. Top one there. Apologies for no such thing as a silly question. Is there anywhere in the REC that you can identify current listed contract managers? So contract managers, no, sorry, anyone can see a list of all contract managers as long as you're a portal user by heading to the party operations section of the portal and clicking on, I believe it is called the party register. The REC party register, which is updated around about once a week with changes with contract manager information, and it's a list of all parties with their nominated contract manager and their contact email address. So on the party operations page of the REC portal, as long as you're a portal user, you'll be able to access the party register where contract manager information is stored. Should the definition of contract managers be changed to reflect that there could be multiple users on SDEP? I don't know whether this is referring to the definition of contract managers in the REC itself, which actually I believe does allow under the REC, unlike MRA and SPA, it does allow for multiple individuals to be appointed to the role of contract manager within an organisation, I think. And I don't know if you've got any more information on that one.
I think it was more of trying to differentiate between contract managers as that role under the REC as a wider, and actually that final escalation point that multiple users can be assigned to the SDEP escalation level, but there is still what was almost like delegated within there to resolve it, rather than necessarily seeing each of those people who are assigned to pick up that level as being contract managers. It's more of they're resolving that level, but it's within an organisation that we'd want them to manage that, and as appropriate assign the users appropriately to that level of escalation. Under the REC, the theory is there's the one contract manager, but actually within SDEP that multiple people can be assigned just for the resolution of those escalations. I see John's come on, is probably going to give a better kind of fuller answer.
No, I think that was okay. I just wanted to clarify. So the assumption is that final escalation goes to the contract manager. Paul is correct. There can be multiple contract managers under the REC. So a party can appoint multiple people to perform that role. The assumption when that goes there is that it's going to the contract manager. There is the functionality in the SDEP to assign other users to receive that, because that's how the SDEP works. However, if a contract manager chooses to do that, then the assumption is still that it's going to the contract manager, and the contract manager is responsible for resolving it. And if it isn't resolved, the assumption is it's the contract manager who's failed to resolve it. So I thought it's probably just worth clarifying that point.
Thanks, John.
Top one at the moment is a question around auto archiving. Currently, SDEP auto archives queries after no responses after 30 days. Now, I'm assuming that was part of the solution design when it was put together, although I'm not 100% confident. But the question is whether we can put a stop to that auto archiving. Beth, I don't think we can't unilaterally do that. There would have to be some sort of a request raised on that respect, I would imagine.
Yes, and that area is something that's within the scope of the SDEP review. There are sort of two sides to it, that it can be a very useful function that you don't have to be going back into the system. Once you've taken the necessary actions, you can just leave things to kind of naturally expire. But we do appreciate that it can cause other issues for people as well. So we're trying to find the best solution to those.
Carl, you raised your hand briefly. Then was that your question?
It wasn't my question, but also archiving was part of the security features. Yeah. Because of the personal data. So
yeah, I recall the discussions.
Well, I think the other thing just to note on that is that there is an element of assumed storage volumes as well in the design as well. So any changes to that would need to assess if the existing storage limits are sufficient if there was a change to that.
Thank you for the clarification. Okay, and top ones on reporting again. I think we've sufficiently covered reporting now. Another requirement for report to show Empan and priorities for escalations at each stage. Beth, unless you've got anything more to add on that one, I think we've probably picked that up already.
Nothing else from me, thank you.
Yep. I will go back and show the second slide, but I just want to clear down these last questions. So apologies to the person. I know that was someone raised that nice and early.
Paul, I've just stuck them in the chat, so if that person can see the chat, they should be in there.
Even better. Thanks, Neil. If there's a specific question on that second slide, of course, we'll be happy to answer it. The next question, the DNO does not have functionality to raise cross-meter issues messages on SDEP with a supplier. Is there an alternative recommended method to do so? I don't know whether Reco have been asked the question, but I'm not sure whether it's a Reco answer or it's a code manager answer. John, do you have a view on this
one? I can answer that at the point back in the days of the MRA, when the cross-meter map at the time was being put together, it started out with an option for the DNO to refer it to the supplier, and then that was taken out of scope through an IREG agreement, and agreed that that would happen offline in the existing mechanisms, and the supplier would raise it through the cross-meter portal. So that's the history behind that. If there was a need to revisit that for some reason, then I'd suggest getting in touch with either the change team or the TDA to pick up the suggestion. Anne Claire, was that from you?
Yeah, it was. Yeah. So as a DNO, we don't have the functionality to raise it with the supplier, even though the schedule at the moment does mention that it is one of the origination of one of those issues, i.e. the DNO getting in touch with the supplier. So we don't have a way of raising it through the SDEP, which also means that then it's difficult to keep track of what's happened to our request, because then it disappears with the supplier and they deal with it through the cross-meter resolution portal, which we don't have access to. So yeah, several issues there in one.
Okay, I'd suggest picking it up through the change process, because that was a deliberate design decision at the point that the IREG put together the process and kept in that reference to the DNOs notifying it to the supplier, but with the view that that would be outside of the system, because their job was to notify it and then leave it to the supplier to resolve. And if there are different views on that now from when that discussion happened 3 odd years ago or whenever it was, then it's worth bringing back to the table so it could be considered.
Yeah, I was going to say, happy to kind of pick up a conversation on that and explore and see, what we can do around taking that forward, or at least understanding impacts that you're currently seeing at the moment.
Yeah, and just to answer that question, I think it's really got to do with the customer relationship. They've got in touch with us, and the only thing we can say is, yes, we've raised the supplier, and then if they come back in touch with us in 3 weeks' time, there's not much we can do. So they experience a rubbish customer experience, and we have very little left that we can actually escalate or do to help them.
Thank you. Sounds like there might be a clear use case for change, the case for change. So thanks, Anne Claire. That's a really useful comment. Wonderful. Last few questions then, mostly around the user guides, actually, it seems. Do we have a user guide on changes to be made in the SDEP portal? I don't think there's I think there is a user guide, an SDEP user guide that will be live upon version 3 go live. I don't think it specifically draws out, unless I'm wrong, I haven't seen it in detail, unless it specifically draws out what the changes are between what it is now and what it will be. I don't know whether anyone has any more information on anything that might be produced around that. This session today was obviously intended to be that provision of that detail around what some of the changes will be, and we'll make the slides available to be shared as well. Anne?
I'm not 100%, and I will take the action away, but I think the guide is just an updated version of the guide rather than specifically focusing on what these changes are. It's just meant to be an updated version. But I think what we'll do is we'll have a look at that with the service provider and just make sure that's covered up, because obviously we can see there that the 3 escalation phases seem to be within that guide still. So we'll just have a look at that as well.
Yes, and thank you for raising that, whoever it was, around the new user guide still having the 3 bell escalation phases. We'll make sure the issue is flagged with the service provider so that they can address it as part of their review. Also on guidance, does the SDEP guidance include a reporting guide? The SDEP guidance, or the SDEP user guide, is specifically, I believe, around the system developed by the service provider. I don't think, Beth and Neil, that incorporates reporting as well. Is there a separate guide for use of reporting?
No, I think I'll just double check it's still in the same one. But at the back of the user guide is an appendix which lists out the different reports that are currently available to run on the system.
That's perfect. Thank you for confirming. And then we have someone raise their hand. I can't see who it is, but if you want to.
Yeah. Just on the user guide, right? So someone is mentioning there is updated user guide. Where can I find this updated user guide? Is it on the switching portal? Yeah.
It's on the REC portal. So on the REC portal, I will send a link out as someone's just sent out there. We'll send it out with the post event information. But essentially, if you go to the REC portal, and you go to the REC documents page, which you can find a link to on the front page of the portal in a box on the right hand side, it says REC documents. And if you go onto that, and then there's a button on that page which is for the REC version 3 baseline documents, and then all the documents that have been prepared in readiness for REC version 3 go live on July the 18th are stored in that REC version 3 baseline document area on the REC portal.
Okay, so there are 26 schedules there, right? So
there's schedules, and then you can see as well there are a number of tabs. So it's not one of the schedules. There's a separate tab. I think it's called user guides or something like that. We'll as I say, we'll send the link out straight after the session. I'll get someone to stick it on the chat for this group before the session's out. Actually, in fact, you know what?
Okay.
I'll get it now. It won't take me a second.
Sure. Yeah. No problem. Thank you.
No worries at all. So yes, it's the link I'm going to post into the chat now, and once you're on that page, if you head over to the tab which is called Category 3 Products, so you'll see REC schedules, service definitions, data specification, and Category 3 products. And then in that list, you'll see a list of all the user guides, which right at the bottom includes the SDEP user guide version 3 with a download link for that. So that's the latest version of the SDEP user guide, which will go live on July the 18th. And the final question then, I'm not fully sure I understand, so I might ask for clarification, but in the scope of the change point 2, is the new final escalation point the contract manager? I'm not sure if that's referring perhaps to the change 2 being the new messages.
So I think it's if we're talking about this final escalation, that is the contract manager. So the first escalation level is always going to be that operational contact, and because there is the consistent escalation processes across all of the different operational processes, then yes, it is that contract manager. As John mentioned, it is the contract manager's responsibility for the resolution of the final escalations. However, SDEP does allow multiple users, but ultimately responsibility sits with that contract manager.
Just a reminder, there's that table on that screen there that shows first, second, third line being the code manager, with ultimately the fourth line, if required, being up to the REC PAB.
And may I ask a question on that? It was me who raised that one. In that, it's the diagram, or it's the pictures that are in the chat. So not this page, but it just shows final escalation. Yeah, any of these, it shows final escalation. So if you're saying that that's the contract manager who does that, does that mean the contract manager has a new message chat that they have to message through? Like, because at the moment, contract managers only message through the contract manager chat on SDEP. So now are we saying that there's also a final escalation that contract managers must sign into, that they must send messages through the final escalation for cross meters or for duplicate meter points?
So it's this replacement of the current contract manager. And I'm gonna, I don't know, Beth or Neil, kind of from a more technical perspective. My assumption of this is it's a replacement of the current contract manager named escalation. And we're kind of calling it this first and final, and that final is that contract manager. I don't know, Beth or Neil, kind of from your perspective, if you wanted to confirm that as well from a technical perspective.
I'd have to take that away. I have to admit I don't know exactly how that's been translated into the system, so we can confirm.
Yeah, that'll be helpful, because just at the moment we only use one communication method, which is one chat. For gas and electricity it's separate, but it's only one. And then if that's the case, it sounds like there's multiple that contract managers would have to assign themselves to. I just wasn't quite aware.
Thank you, Rachel. We'll make sure you got an answer to that one. A couple more questions come in since I was last here. Are parties able to use bots on the system, for example, to automate responses once flows have been sent? There was a question as well, disappeared, I'm not sure it was withdrawn, about progress of the SDEP API development, and I think the two are linked, aren't they? What's the latest on API usage within SDEP?
There is a, I think the party impact assessment is still out for change proposal R9. So if you go onto the portal and have a look at that and see what the proposed requirements are, yeah, do feedback your thoughts on the party impact assessment. I think there's a little bit more time before it closes. I have in my mind the 13th or 14th, but I could be wrong.
Wonderful, thank you. And the use of bots on the system, I think is not allowed, and the API is being brought in as a mechanism to allow you to have a degree of automation onto SDEP without resorting to bots. There is a capacity problem, well, not a problem, a capacity element with respect to SDEP, which means that bots are strongly discouraged. Okay. I see 2 messages. So someone duplicate and cross meter escalation instead of 4. Which are the 4 messages? There were 2 slides there. You may have seen that as I flicked through. So there's 2 slides with 2 different messages on. We'll share the slides after the session. So hopefully you'll be able to get that more clearly. And finally, can you put together a few slides and circulate on what contract managers should do in SDEP for an example query? I don't know whether, Beth, that's something contained within the SDEP user guide or whether there's something else that can be put together to support that request.
Yeah, if that's something that people feel they would need, we can have a look at how we could do that.
Okay. Might be worth, if that's a formal request, just getting in touch with the service desk after the session, and we can put you in touch with Beth and Beth's team, and we can firm up exactly what support might be provided. And just to remind as well, if you are a REC party, which I assume you are, you do have the ability to have a chat with your operational account managers as well, and your OEMs will be able to provide you with guidance and support and raise requests on your behalf for more information that can help you navigate some of these arrangements and talk you through what needs to be done. So I do encourage you, if you're not already in regular contact with your OEMs, to make use of that service that exists. All right. Thank you very much. I think we are just about coming to the end of our questions. We've still got some time, so I'm not going to cut you off quite yet. While I'm waiting for any final questions that come through, I'm just going to remind you that we have been recording today's session, and we are going to post an edited recording of this session onto a REC Code Manager YouTube channel within the next couple of days, hopefully by the end of tomorrow, as long as my internet is strong enough at home to get the recording uploaded. Otherwise it will be at the start of next week when I'm in the office, and I'll make sure that the slides are uploaded as well. If you're not familiar with our REC Wiki, every event that the REC Code Manager hosts has its own page article on our REC Wiki, and we host the link to the recording and to the slides and any other materials that are relevant to the topic on the event wiki article. So it's a useful resource if you just search within the wiki for the date of the event or SDEP event or whatever you want to search. It will pull up the article and you can access all the materials and remind yourself of the content. And I'll put some information for the speakers down as well, so you've got a route in to contact us if you've got specific questions on anything we've discussed today. But we don't seem to have any more questions. So the last thing I'm going to flip over to now, if you're on Slido, you'll see your screen flip over at this stage, and it's to provide us with just some feedback, if you wouldn't mind, about the event today, how whether you found it useful, and then some more qualitative feedback on what you've liked about the event and what suggestions you might have for how we might improve the way the events are run in future. If you do have more questions with respect to the content that we've discussed today, you've always got access to the service desk. You raise a ticket via the REC portal, or send us an email to inquiries@recmanager.co.uk, or, as I mentioned, to go through your operational account managers, who will be more than happy to support you understanding some of these changes coming in. And just finally as well, you're hopefully aware by now that in the run up to REC version 3 go live on the 18th of July, we've organised a number of engagement sessions looking at some of the elements of things that are changing on CSS go live day on the 18th of July, helping you to navigate and understand the impacts of some of those different elements on your parties. If you don't know about them, you can visit the REC news page on the portal, and there's a tab in there to see all the upcoming events which you can register for. They're all held virtually like this one, and they'll all give you the opportunity to ask your questions and get responses from experts within the Code Manager team and other organizations that have touch points into the Code Manager team as well. So I do encourage you to come along, or if you can't come along, can't make it, as I said before, we record all these sessions and make them available to you. I know it's not often easy to find an hour to watch back the recording, but it's easy often to find that hour than to come along to the exact hour that we've set aside for these events. So hopefully you'll find that approach flexible, suitable for your needs. But okay, I'm gonna wrap up the event here, and thank you very much for your time that you've taken today, and thank you as well to the time that our speakers and our panel have taken to come along and answer your questions. If you need us, I've given you the routes in to contact us, and otherwise I look forward very much to speaking to you at the next REC Code Manager event. Thank you very much.